So in our custom to-do animation, we have duplicated the implementation of the fade-in effect. Let's go ahead and refactor this. Back to our animations module. Down the bottom, here's our fade trigger. Now the problem that we have with this implementation is that our transition only includes a call to the animate function. So the previous style, which is opacity of 0, is outside this transition. We defined it as part of a state. The problem we have here is that we can only reuse the content of a transition. In other words, when we create a reusable animation using the animation function, what we pass here is only the content of the transition function. We cannot pass a state here. So we need to change this implementation and add the opacity of 0 as part of the transition, so then we can create a reusable animation. First, I'm going to duplicate this and separate the enter and leave transitions. So here's the enter and here's the leave transition. Now, when the element is entering the view, I want to change the style immediately. I want to set the opacity to 0, like this. And then when it's leaving the screen, I want to change the style over this given period. And then we don't need the state anymore. So with this, we can create a reusable animation. So I'm going to declare another variable. Let's call this fade in, and I add the word animation. Make sure to add this word so you can differentiate between reusable animations and reusable triggers, like this fade trigger. All right, so here we're going to call the animation function. And as the argument, we're going to pass the content of this transition. Goes here, like this. And then here, for the enter transition, we can reuse this animation. So we call use animation and give it fade in animation. Now, as I told you before, because here we have only one step, we can get rid of the square brackets and make our code cleaner. Now, similarly, we could create another reusable function like fade out animation and apply it here. And this way our code will be more consistent. But I leave that to you as an exercise. Now let's take this to the next level. In this implementation, we have hard-coded the duration, 2000 milliseconds. What if somewhere else in the application, we want a different duration, or perhaps a different easing function? Well, the good thing is that we can add parameters to these reusable animations. So let's see how this works. First of all, I'm going to change this from a number to a string. So earlier you learned that here we can pass a duration, like 2 seconds, and optionally a delay and an easing. Let's say ease out, because we're bringing something into the view. Remember the opposite words, in and out? Now I want to make these values dynamic. I want to add parameters here. So instead of 2 seconds, I'm going to add interpolation, just like the interpolation we have in our templates. And in this interpolation, I'm going to render duration. So this is the name of our parameter. And similarly, I'm going to add another parameter here, easing. Now I want to give these default values in case the client of this code doesn't provide these values. So as the second argument to the animation function, we can provide an animation options object. Let's have a quick look at the documentation. So let's have a look at the animation function. Okay, here it is. So look, this function takes 2 parameters. The first one is steps, which can be either an instance of animation metadata or animation metadata array if we have multiple steps. As I told you before, whenever you see animation metadata, drop these words. So what can we pass here? In theory, you can pass the return value of any of the functions defined in the animations module. But this is actually a design problem in the animations module. If you're more experienced and you're familiar with the solid principles of object-oriented programming, there we have a concept called Liskov's substitution principle. So here is a real-world example of the violation of this principle. So Angular team have defined this hierarchy where animation metadata is an interface on the top, and below this we have a bunch of different interfaces that extend this interface. So in principle, if a function takes an animation metadata, it should be able to get any of its derivatives. But in this case, you cannot pass certain types to the animation function. You will get a runtime error. And this is an example of a bad hierarchy design. We don't want to get into more details about that. So back here in the signature of the animation function, look at the second parameter, animation options. Now let's take a look at the documentation of this interface. Animation options. So this interface defines a type with these two fields, and they're both optional. We use the params field to supply any parameters to our reusable animations. So back here, as the second argument to the animation function, I'm passing an animation options object. This object should have a property called params, which is an object. And in this object, we'll have one or more key value pairs to supply the default values for our parameters. So here for duration, I'm going to use 2 seconds. And for easing, I'm going to use ease out. These are my default values. Now the consumer of this animation function can override these values. So let's go back to our to-dos component and reuse this animation. This is our enter transition where we have implemented the fade in effect. I'm going to delete these two lines and instead call use animation fade in animation. And here as the second argument, look, we can optionally pass an animation options object. So an object, this object has a property called params, which is also an object. And here we add a bunch of key value pairs to override the default values. Let's say I want to change the duration only. I can set this to 500 milliseconds. Now let's take a look at the result. Back in the browser, refresh. We have a quick fade in effect. Beautiful. So here's the lesson. When creating reusable animations using the animation function, you can add parameters to your animations. Now, as a second argument to the animation function, you can supply the default values for these parameters. Now, the consumer of this animation can override these values. So back to our to-dos component. When we call the use animation function, optionally as the second argument, we can pass an animation options object, and here we override the default values.